we were talking about the unit circle, and we're talking about trying to identify the location of a particular angle, which we are going to call theta. So theta is like an x, it's a variable. And so we've got quadrant, this is quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4 on the coordinate plane, right? And one of the things that we know about quadrant 1 is that all of the x values are positive and all of the y values are positive. Over in the second quadrant, all of the x values are negative and all the y values are positive. Now in the third quadrant, all of the x values are negative and all of the y values are negative. Okay, so like the point down here would be like -3 and -2. Okay, now over here in the fourth quadrant, all of the x values are positive and all of the y values are negative. So then when we combine that with the fact that cosine is associated with, cosine of theta is basically the x coordinate and that sine of theta is the y coordinate. So now we can try and understand whether an angle is in the first quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, or fourth quadrant given some information. For example, if we are told that cosine of theta is greater than 0 and that sine of theta is less than 0, well, this just means that cosine is positive, and this means that sine is negative. So theta, the angle theta, must be in the quadrant, or it must have an angle into the quadrant where the x's are positive and the y's are negative, and that is the fourth quadrant. So this indicates that theta is in the is in quadrant 4, okay? Quadrant 4, because x is positive and y is negative, okay? Now it gets a little more complicated when we're dealing with tangents and cotangents and secants and cosecants. But if you remember that tangent of theta is equal to sine of theta divided by cosine of theta, we have just turned it into sine and cosine. And if you remember that cotangent, that's cosine, that cotangent of theta is equal to cosine of theta over sine of theta, okay, then that helps too. See, basically we just have to turn these into sines and cosines. So we also know that secant of theta is equal to 1 over cosine of theta. And lastly, we know that cosecant of theta is equal to 1 over sine of theta. So now it's easy. So now give me anything. Okay, cotangent of theta is greater than 0, and secant of theta is less than 0. Okay, well that means secant, see, I prefer to do the cotangents and tangents last. Secant is the same thing as 1 over cosine of theta, and we're saying that this is less than 0. Well, the 1 in the numerator is always positive, so that means that cosine has to be negative. In order for the whole thing to be negative, cosine must be negative, because a positive divided by a negative is less than 0. It's a negative. And therefore, we know that cosine is less than 0. Knowing that cosine is negative means that we know that the answer to this theta is either in quadrant 2 or quadrant 3, because in quadrants 1 and 4, cosine is positive. So it has to be either 2 or 3. Now we're going to go to cotangent to find out whether it's quadrant 2 or quadrant 3. Well, cotangent is equal to cosine over sine. Okay? And and if this is greater than 0, well, the only way a division problem, a fraction, the only way that this can possibly be positive is if the numerator and the denominator were the same sign. So in order for cotangent to be positive, in order for cosine divided by sine to be positive, then it either has to be a positive over a positive, or it has to be a negative over a negative. But we already know that cosine is negative. So if cosine is negative, that must mean that sine is also negative. Sine of theta must be less than 0. It must be negative in order to make cotangent positive, because cosine is positive. So that means that sine and cosine are both negative, which means that the answer to this one is quadrant 3. Okay? You can do this with all of the problems. You just have to convert all your tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant, convert them into sine and cosine, and then identify whether the x and y are positive or negative, and find out which quadrant they're in. That's how you do those. Okay. Have a good day.